The bees had always found Bitterbridge sweet even when banners outnumbered blossoms and the air smelled of oil and harness. In the low light before dawn, the gardens breathed up warm scent. Crushed mint beneath the cook's feet, old roses leaning heavily against the trellises. Wet earth, dew. Margaery Tyrell stood with her grandmother where the hedges opened upon the river and watched mist burn off the mander as if a veil were being lifted from a dreaming bride. "My brother will ride himself to a bone," Margaery said, not looking at the camp so much as listening to it. The creak of leather, the murmur of grooms, the tongues of 100 southern houses, song and oath newly broken, grief loud and hot and careless in its wounds. Any road that points at Stannis is a road he'll take. The Queen of Thorns tapped her cane against an exposed root and smiled at the river as if it had told a jest. Stannis does not care a whit for roads. He will lay a line with a rule and expect the land to shape itself. He is a hard tide. One may build above him or drown. Margaery turned. There was a raven pinned in her grandmother's fist, small and black and ominously quiet. The bird had flown through the night with words that were ash by the time most men woke. Renly lay cold beneath the thunder of rumor. The Baratheon tent was gone to ghosts. Power was a fruit that ripened in a day and rotted in an hour. "This one," said Olenna Tyrell, shaking loose the scrap that had come from the Riverlands. "This wolf cub is not a man to be dismissed. He has beaten Ser Jaime Lannister, and that is a thing even fools will remember. The North crowns him and the trident besides. His men are cold but constant, which is better than warm and faithless, and he has a mother with iron in her." The old woman's eyes were needles. "He needs bread. We have bread. He needs friends. We have armies. He needs a queen." Margaery's fingers, gloved against the damp, pressed together until the leather creaked. It was not the shape she had imagined for herself. They had dressed her in green and gold and taught her to move like grace and to speak like water. She had learned how to warm a hall, how to cool a temper, how to look at a man without giving the same look to the man beside him. To be the South's flower was one thing. To go north with winter under her feet, another. "The phrase," she said, "because the obvious thorns must be named first. Old Walder will squeal like a hog parted from his slop. Then we must feed him," Olenna said. "That is all pigs understand. And Loras." Olenna's mouth softened, but only for a heartbeat. "He loved Renly for himself, Margaery, but he loved him also for what he made him, gold in the sun, a knight adored. Your brother is not a boy to be soothed with reason. Leave him raw for now. He will do as he is told when duty is dressed as vengeance." Margaery looked down to the river, where a fisherman was drawing his net with steady hands, indifferent to banners. She had been taught that all marriages were nets, woven of name and field, oath and dowry. A queen could choose which knots to tug, which cords to cut. "He is a wolf," she said. "I have only ever hunted with hawks." "Wolves and hawks both have teeth," said Olenna, "but wolves have packs. You will learn them." Margaery did not ask if the North would have her. She asked how to begin. "Send for Catelyn Stark," said the Queen of Thorns, as if asking for a spoon. "If you want a kingdom, bargain with its mother." It was Catelyn's eyes that Robb remembered later, the way they held two griefs at once without letting one spill into the other. She had ridden hard to Riverrun, dust in the seams of her hands, Brienne of Tarth behind her like a tower sunk into the earth. They brought with them the night that had killed a king and sent 1,000 vows running like wax. In the great hall where Lord Hoster Tully dozed in his sickness and summer light slashed through the colored glass, the small council assembled, the Blackfish with his river-weathered face, the Great John with laughter always close behind his anger, Roose Bolton with his pale eyes and softer voice, Edmure eager and unbloodied for all the maps he had stared at, and the boy who wore the sword of the North like a man who did not notice the weight until he lay down to sleep. Catelyn set the sealed letter on the table and kept her hand upon it. "The Tyrells are quick," said Roose, as if speaking of a knife in the dark. His quiet carried more than shouting. "Yesterday they were Renly's. Today they are their own." "They are always their own," answered the Blackfish. It is the nature of gardens to climb over their neighbors if the wall is soft. Will they put bread in our mouths? Asked the great Jon. Then let them climb. Catelyn broke the wax. She read, and her face did not change, though later she would tell herself that was the moment when the war turned like a fish in a net. They offer me their daughter, Robb said when she had finished. He was standing because he could not bear to sit with such words doing quick work in his blood. And with her, bread and men, gold and the red wine fleet when it's loosed. They will march not east to King's Landing, but north and west, where Tywin lies fat and unsuspecting. They ask that we recognize the Reach's rights in Old Town and the Mander, and that we send grain to the south when winter deepens. They ask. He could not help but smile. He was a boy and a king both, and the two wrestled for his mouth. They ask to learn our words for snow. Walder Frey will spit out his teeth, Edmure said. You gave him your troth. I gave him my thanks, Robb corrected, and a promise to do honor. There was no paper. There was need. When Lord Frey held the twins, he sold me a crossing for a nod. He meant to trade that nod for my neck when it suited him. Small things remember slights longer than great ones, murmured Roose, lacing white fingers. But small things are crushed by feet in the end. Catelyn's hand remained on the table as if to hold it steady. Walder Frey will not be ignored. He has sons and swords and a bridge that we must cross again and again. He is a man grown sour, and sour men do not ferment into wine. If you take another bride, you must fill his cup with something he can drink without choking. Edmure, Brynden Tully said, turning to the Lord of Riverrun as if to a young soldier on his first wall. How do you fancy a Frey? Edmure's flush was swift and honest. If it keeps my folk from burning, I'll wed whatever Walder puts forward. He will put forward many, said the Blackfish dryly. Robb's eyes had not left his mother. He had learned these last months that the map was paper and men were water. The ink lines made sense until the river rose. You could not fight a river. You learned to lay your stones. Speak to them, he said, to the Queen of Thorns, to Margaery. The name tasted odd and pleasant for being unfamiliar. Tell them the North has customs and a heart tree and long memories. Tell them I would put my hand in hers beneath a bough that watched my father grow. Tell them we bring no southern gods to the godswood. Tell them we do not sing in the snow unless it is to the wolves. And Walder? Asked Catelyn. Tell him, Robb said, and now the boy went quiet and the king spoke, that my uncle will wed his daughter and that my cousin will squire for his son, and that I will make him keeper of the trident for as long as the river runs. Tell him this, I do not forget a debt, and I do not forget an insult. Then we must pluck him with honey, said the great Jon with a grin, and bind him with rope. The parley was held beneath lime trees at Bitterbridge, the leaves throwing 1,000 small shadows like coins. The Tyrell pavilion was hung with green that a drop of morning would wet into emerald, and the tables were laden as if war were far away. Small white cheeses threaded with herbs, figs split and painted with cream, bread whose crusts cracked like laughter when broken. The Queen of Thorns wore a skein of blue about her shoulders and a spray of needles about her tongue. You are Robb Stark's mother? Olenna said, tapping Catelyn's hand with her cane as if confirming the grain of a plank. I expected someone taller, but then I expected many things that did not arrive. Kings who live, swords that don't bend. We must make do. See, eat. If I give you advice with an empty mouth, I'll be taken for an old fool. If I give it with a full one, I'll be taken for a rude old fool. I prefer the latter. It makes men honest. Brienne stood a pace behind Catelyn, bright and unmissable in her blue. She had cleaned the blood from Renly's gorget with her own hands and said nothing of it since. The Blackfish flanked the Lady of Winterfell opposite Willis Tyrell, who had a clever, thoughtful face made handsomer by the scars of his broken leg and the cane he did not pretend was anything but needed. Margaery was quiet. She sat without rustling. The river breeze tugged one strand of her hair loose, and she did not chase it. When she looked at Catelyn, she did not look up through lashes or down along a practiced line. She looked straight, and Catelyn felt the solidity of a door set well in its frame. "If we do this," Margaery said when bread had been torn and the first measure of politeness sipped, "I will come north with as much bread as grain carts can carry, and with seamen to mend your boats, and with maesters to teach the southern ways of barley to the northern soil. The reach is generous because it is fat. But I know the north is proud and lean. You have your gods. Keep them. You have your ways. Keep them. I will not bring a sept into your gods' wood. I will learn your words for snow, if you will teach me." "You will bring the red wine fleet?" Brynden asked, business always like a fishbone in his throat, insisting upon attention. Olenna waved a hand. "When my son has pried it off the shields the Iron Men have kindly stolen. It seems the Greyjoys never heard of a proper invitation." "We have," said Catelyn, the iron crossing her voice before she softened it. "And we know what it is to be poor in war. I will not lie. The North will not kneel to the Iron Throne again. Robb is king in the North and by the Trident. If your daughter comes north, she comes to be queen there and not elsewhere. That elsewhere is presently held by a man who reads the law the way a carpenter reads a straight edge," remarked Willis mildly. "If Stannis takes King's Landing, he will want oaths. If we go to him hungry, we will give them. If we go to him on full bellies with other choices, he may give to us." "And Tywin?" asked the Blackfish. "He does not share." "He must be emptied," Olenna said, as if speaking of a cellar, "and his salt kept for winter use. We will go west with you. Randall will lead. He does not enjoy laughter, which suits war. You will carve where he cannot go. Wolves carve. Men follow." Margaery's hands lay easy on the tablecloth. "There is also Walder Frey." The name smelled like a wound. Catelyn met the girl's eyes and envied. Not for the first time. Those whose hearts could still be set on other things than not breaking. "My son will offer him marriages enough to found a village," she said, "and a title that will let him look downriver and imagine it all belongs to him. But he must be fed more than pride. He must be made indispensable in a way that cannot be undone." "Let my cousins wed his daughters," Margaery said at once, as if they had prepared for this branch of the path and found it clear of brambles. "Let them carry Frey blood to the Mander. Let old Walder have a reason to count southern grandchildren when he cannot sleep. And let the Freys think of Reachland Table when the river breaks its banks," Olenna added. "Nothing sweetens bitterness like the taste of butter." It was agreed beneath the lime trees with a parchment that recorded far less than the talk had made. The wind lifted the edges of the page. The wax made a neat red mouth over the ribbon. When Catelyn bent to seal it, Margaery placed her hand over the edge of the table, and the two women's knuckles brushed. "I cannot promise you happiness," Margaery said low, "for the moment was theirs and not anyone else's. I can promise you that I will stand with him in front of the cold, and that when I must counsel him, I will do it with clean truth and not with what I want for myself." Catelyn felt a strange unmooring, like the sensation before sleep when the bed ceases to be a thing and becomes a place that holds the shape of you. She thought of Ned's hand on her wrist in Winterfell's Godswood and the way he had looked at the bone-white face of the weirwood and then at her. She thought that if the North must take a flower, let it be one that knows how to grow with its roots buried in stone. "Then come north," she said. Robb had learned, by then, that battle smells the same wherever you take it. Steel, sweat, fear, the sweet iron of blood, and the odd, bitter smoke of cooked leather. But the West had its own taste, sun-baked wheat and a drier wind, the hills shouldering up like beasts, the gold of banners that were not Lannister alone but all their sworn men, called at last from their easy shadows. He broke Ser Stafford's host outside the crag with the kind of speed that makes men say a thing is luck before they have to call it skill. Grey wind ran where he ran, and the enemy broke like corn before a boy's clean scythe. Randyll Tarly did not laugh. He set his vanguard like stones driven deep in the river's path and made Tywin come on to them at a place where the ground argued with hooves. The Reach Knights were orderly death. The North came like a door kicked in. Between them, the Westerlands learned a new song. At night, Robb wrote letters by bad rushlight and better memory. He told his mother he would not be late. He told Edmure to hold and not to be brave in stupid ways. He wrote one letter to a girl he had never seen. He started it a dozen times before he remembered that he could not write to Margaery like any other lord's daughter, and that he must. He told her of a hill where he had found, between two old stones, a clutch of pale flowers with their faces turned west to the last light, and that they had made him think of the way the air had smelled in Summerfell. A word he stopped himself from using and then let stand. He told her that men from the Reach had given soup to children whose fathers had once sworn to Lannister, and that when he had thanked them they had said their lady had instructed them not to hoard grace. He told her he was not a man made for letters. He asked for the words for bread that meant more than bread. Margaery read those letters in a room at Highgarden where the windows were big as sails and the walls cooled the afternoon like wine. She wrote back without the prettiness that ladies used for lords who were not theirs. She told him that in the Reach there were a dozen words for rain and 3 for the different ways a cornfield could sound when wind went over it. She told him that her brother Loras had broken 3 practice lances in the yard that morning and that he was quieter now, as a storm sometimes is after it drops its first hammer and before it unsheathes its second. She told him to show his men he bled and to hide his fear where only the 2 of them could see it. She asked for the names of the wolves in his company. She asked him what trees made the best whistles and whether the northern women sang different songs when the ice came. The Freys were fed. He rode to the twins with the Blackfish and 3 Tyrell envoys whose faces were smooth as water and who listed names the way a baker counts loaves. Walder had put on a tunic more costly than any he wore last season, and he hated them all the more for making him do it. He cracked his voice like a whip. He named grandsons in waves. He sniffed at the quality of the parchment. He examined the seals as if he thought to find a worm in the wax. In the end, he struck his bargain because the Reach matches were too many to turn, because Keeper of the Trident bore the music of power even if it carried none, because Catelyn Stark's eyes did not look away, and because he enjoyed imagining the hurt he could still deliver later. "You'll not make me small," he hissed to the Blackfish as if he whispered, "and you'll not make me forget." "We are counting upon your memory, my lord," Brynden said, and smiled with a riverman's teeth. The wedding at Riverrun was a river wedding. The Tully fish swam on every corner of cloth. The wine was red as sunset on the water. The flicker of torchlight turned marble into moving flesh. A singer from Old Town tried his Southron hand at a northern dirge and made the old women weep anyway. Robb wore a doublet of grey with a direwolf's head embroidered clean along the breast, and grey wind lay at his feet for the ceremony, blinking slow, as if he knew the work. The heart tree had been brought in pieces. Not the sacred weirwood, which cannot be moved, but a bough cut from a white birch and set in a heavy cauldron of river mud, the leaves pale as milk. Margaery touched the peeling bark as if greeting a friend she had not met. A Septon murmured the southern words and then stepped aside, and beneath the bough Robb took Margaery's hands. The hall was full, everyone breathing at once, and yet the sound seemed to move away, as if it knew how to grant privacy to vows that deserved it. "I am of the North," Robb said, "and I have been made king there, but I was a boy born in the South, and I remember the taste of plums from the market and the way the rain smelled at night. I remember my mother's hands, and my father's quiet, and the look of frost at the Godswood's edge. If I am to be king, I must be a bridge. I ask you to walk with me." Margaery's eyes did not go wet. Her voice was steadier than most men's in a charge. "I am of the Reach, and I have been taught to measure by plenty. I have learned how to make a hall warm, how to turn aside a quarrel with the right word and the right touch. I know how to plant in rich soil, but I have seen the way a wild flower blooms from a crack in stone. If I am to be queen, I must be a seed that knows different earth. I ask you to plant me." They bound wrists with a strip of undyed wool. The old women made noises that meant luck. Loras Tyrell did not smile, but his sister's fingers caught his for a heartbeat when the crowd surged, and he bore it. There was a betting, of course, as there is always betting, even when there should not be. Men shouted, and someone tried to lift the bride, and the great John bellowed a thing that made small ladies hide their faces. But Robb raised a hand, and the noise was cut in the middle like a rope sawed through. "In the North," he said, "we do not push wolves. We trust them to find each other. They spent their first night in a chamber with tallow candles and a small window on the river. Robb tasted the salt of his own sweat, the faint sweetness of her skin like apple peel, the clean linen. They were not strangers after all. Two people who had learned young that duty is the first face of love and its last. When she slept, he lay awake listening to the slow turn of water against the bank and thought that his father should have been there to say something wise and spare and exact, and that, failing him, the river would do. King's Landing burned green. The wildfire ate a line across Blackwater Rush like some storybook serpent. Ships bucked moored to chains that held until they did not. The air itself was a weapon. Tyrion Lannister stood with blood in his hair and shouted until his voice empty. The hound fled and some followed him. The small folk locked their doors and drank and prayed and prayed and drank. Sansa Stark knelt in a chamber where a queen had once plucked at her sleeves and told her not to grow. She prayed to a god she had shaped with the particularity of girls. A bit of the warrior, a bit of the mother, a hope that was not a face but a feeling, a light at the end of a hall. There was no Tyrell banner on the horizon. There was no thunder of Mace's showy host, no shining lanceheads in their tens of thousands to drive Stannis back and let the lion breathe. There was Stannis in counted mail and counted men, and Davos with his sober eyes, and the remorselessness of arithmetic. By sunset, the bells were ringing a different sound than warning. The day tasted of ash. Joffrey Baratheon was dragged screaming from the Red Keep before night could take him. He used words neither Septa nor Mother had taught him. Stannis said the word bastard, aloud like a hammer. The boy king was not given long. Davos looked away. Cersei Lannister went to a cell that had once held lesser sins. Tyrion, broken and bleeding, was pulled half dead from the piles of bodies by men who wore no badges and had no desire to die for a crown. Varys vanished into whatever shadow he carried with him. Sansa found that prayer is not a bargain. It is a blanket, keeps you warm enough to not die of the night. Tywin Lannister read the word defeat as if it were a smudge on his sleeve he could rub at until the cloth showed clean. He drew his men back into the folds of the West like a cat into its own skin. Robb and Randall came on, the North's howl and the Reach's measured tread. They burned the Lannister granaries. They sent men to harry baggage lines as if they were foxes and not mules. They took golden cups and left wooden spoons and found that a house that calls itself a rock is still made of rooms that can be emptied. Roose Bolton took Harrenhal. He took it like a man who admires ruin. He walked the melted stones with something that might have been love and sent letters with something that was surely calculation. He smiled on the phrase. He wrote to the Dreadfort and to men who owed him fear. He called Ramsay's son in ink before he claimed him in voice and chose messengers who would not be mourned if they did not return. Ravens came north and came north again. Winterfell had fallen to Theon Greyjoy. Winterfell had been burned. Winterfell had been abandoned. Bran and Rickon had been taken. Bran and Rickon had been slain. Theon had disappeared. Men loyal to the flayed man had found a spring in the ashes. Each bird dropped weight into Robb until he felt bent. He kept his words straight-faced and his orders calm because that was what the crown demanded. Margaery sat with him when he read those black-laced lines. She did not tell him there would be better evenings later. She did not turn his head from the wound. She put her hand on the table near his, and when he laid his fingers on hers, she did not move them away. Every man I kill for father and for Winterfell is a man I cannot spare for the sea, he said once, harsh with the kind of honesty that cuts. Balon Greyjoy laughs with a mouth full of our coasts. In the south, Margaery said, we plant olives when a war burns. It is a tree that takes a long time to fruit. It is a way to tell the land we intend to stay. We have pines, he said, and she smiled thinly. At the twins, Edmure Tully wed Rosalind Frye. The girl's smile was the only true thing in the hall aside from the strength of the bridge stones and the black patience of the river. Walder Frye wanted to spit in the stew. He wanted to spill and break. He had men with quarrels in galleries above and knives beneath tufts of hair, and he imagined the reports he would send, the stories he would seat himself within. But the Blackfish walked the hall like a man who had counted men and doors until numbers made a cage. Outside, on both banks, The Reach lay in grass-silent ranks, and the northern banners were heavy with a weather that had learned to rest on shoulders. Roslyn's hand shook as she drank from the cup Edmure held to her. The music never faltered. The strings did not break. The phrase discovered that fear is less easy to serve when it sits so close to its own death. Old Walder kissed his daughter's brow and said something that could be heard as blessing or threat, depending on the ear that caught it. The shoes went up on the table as custom demanded. The bride wept a little, and a few honest tears were finally let down from faces that had needed them. By autumn's hard edge, the west had become a skinned animal. Lannisport's proud facades were smoke-black. The forges rang for other men's swords. Tywin held Casterly Rock behind closed gates he would open only to his own words. The mines ran by torchwork, the ore hauled at the point of argument. It was the wrong end of a tune for lions accustomed to applause. The talk went east like a cautious fire. Stannis had taken King's Landing and spoke law as if he were the only man to have read it. He had named Davos Seaworth his hand, a thing that made some laugh until they stopped. He had seized Cersei's children, the living ones, and set them on a clean shelf where no mother's hand could reach them, their hair uncovered, their names parsed. He had allowed the faith to ring bells that had been silent and to measure boys for knighthood with lines that did not bend around coin. The city ate stale bread and said thank you because it had eaten nothing last month. It turned its head toward the sea each dusk as if expecting a pardon. When Stannis's envoys came to Riverrun, the paragraph they carried fit nicely on one page. The king on the Iron Throne required oaths of fealty. The king in the north replied that his crown was older than Stannis's paper, and that it had been taken upon a weirwood's witness. The envoys raised their eyebrows at the mention of trees. Davos Seaworth came himself thereafter, with a small escort and a narrower face than rumor gave him, the kind that had known hunger as teacher and remained a better student for it. They met in the small council chamber because ceremony does not suit men who have learned to count nails. Davos placed his hands on the table as if they were comfortable there. His eyes took in Margaery as swiftly as they took in the map. "My Lord King," he said, and there was no mockery in it, merely a careful economy. "His Grace remembers the aid your father sent him when he was left to rot at Storm's End. He remembers the girl and the boy given over to feed knights. He remembers that a Stark can be counted upon to keep a gate. The realm has need of gates." "It has need of north," Robb said, and if he felt that memory like a rope across the chest, he did not let it tighten his voice. "And it has need of south to remember we do not bend like rushes." "Stannis bends as much as stone," Davos allowed. "But even stone knows how to sit upon mortar. I speak plainly. He will not name you king. He will name you Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North with rights that have not been granted in living memory. He will ask for men when the Iron Men grow worse. He will ask for grain if the winter is bitter. He will demand justice for traitors on your land, and he will send back those who do not belong in his." Margaery watched him. He did not glance at her as most envoys did. When she spoke, it was not to flirt with truth but to weigh it. "What of the Riverlands?" she asked. "Are they north or south in your king's account book?" "They are bleeding," Davos said, which was no answer and entirely one. "Your Grace," he added to Robb, softening the iron with a little voice, "I will say a thing I should not. Stannis believes in right until it snaps his teeth. He would cut the realm to fit the law. I am a smuggler. I would patch the law to keep the realm." "And what do you want?" Margaery asked him. "Not your king. You." Davos blinked, as if no one had asked him that since he grew into this particular skin. "I want children to keep their fingers in winter," he said, "and I want fewer heads on spikes. I want the steps of the September of Baelor to be worn by feet going in to pray, not to stare. I want your men not to die in rows they needn't. I want the Ironborn dragged back into the sea by the hair." Robb looked down at his own hands. They had small scars from sword and camp and dog. They were not his father's hands, but they had learned some of his father's tricks. Hold and then decide. He raised his eyes, not to the envoy but to his wife. "Bread for oaths," Margaery said, when Davos had gone. the river light slanting through the glass like judgment. Men for men. Call the Riverlands ours and hold them so. Let Stannis call you warden if he must, but let him write that we appoint the lesser wardens, and that we keep our gods. If he wants grain when the snows come, he can send south his paper with our names correctly spelled. And if he wants phrase hung for treasons yet to ripen, remind him we keep pigs in pens until we are ready to eat them. Robb laughed then, once, like something relieved of weight. You sound like my mother, he said, and she did not flinch from being measured against a steel yard that heavy. Your mother and I intend you to live, she said. News from the wall came less often than prayers, but when it came it carried the smell of cold through wax and twine. Jeor Mormont wrote in a hand like boot print. Dead things walking, wildlings massing, crows gone quiet. Men at Riverrun laughed uneasily at the picture of giants and milk-white fiends. Robb did not laugh. He sent men to the mountain clans and silver for the Silent Sisters to carry north, and when one reached night smirked at tales of dead men that did not lie quiet, Margaery asked him if vines grew upon snow and watched the foolish look on his face. You will go north, she told Robb that night, when the candles made little lakes of themselves in tin. And I will go with you. A queen who does not learn the names of her own snow is not a queen. I do not know if we will have a Winterfell to show you, he said. Then you will build me one, she answered. The first stones will be your words. He went to the Godswood as he always had when decisions pinched. The borrowed birch was not a weirwood, and it did not know him any more than any tree knows a man who lays his back to it for the first time. Still, there is a sense in which all trees are the same tree. They talk in a root speech men cannot hear. He put his palm upon the peeling bark and thanked a thing that did not need thanks for witnessing his father and now him. Margaery waited a little way off, respectful as if of a sept she did not share. When he turned, she came and stood in the place where the ground sank slightly and where, perhaps, when the tree was not borrowed, snow would lie deeper in winter for the shape of the earth that had settled under it. I am trying to be both my father's son and not my father, he said. You are trying to be yourself with him inside you, she said. I do the same, only with a rosebush. He took her hand and drew her nearer to the tree. The bark was cold even in summer's last light. The north is hard, he told her. Its love is hard. It does not sing like a reach song. It sits with you in silence and expects you to mend your own gloves. Then I will learn to sew in the quiet, she said. It was not peace they made in the end so much as a truce made large enough to wear a crown. Stannis called Robb warden and the parchment named him king under the heart tree, though only in the eyes that mattered to those who bent knee to weirwoods. The Riverlands were bound to the north by law and habit. The Reach held them safe by grain and steel both. The Ironborn were driven from the shields and then from the Mander's mouth. The Redwyne fleet unmoored and rolled its heavy bellies toward Pike. Tywin Lannister kept to his rock like an adder in its hole and told the West stories of waiting. The faith rang bells without blood. Fewer heads stood on spikes, and those that did had earned it in ways even the small folk would admit over ale. Sansa Stark came up the river under escort with 100 small burn marks healed on her hands and a silence that did not wish to speak of kings or songs. Stannis had not kept her as hostage so much as a measure of his rightness. Davos sent her away at once when the ink dried, and if he wept, he did it where no one could see. When Sansa came into the hall at Riverrun, she found that Catelyn's arms still held a shape that matched her, and she breathed for the first time since bells had rung green. Robb had not wept when the ravens came. He did not weep when his uncle wed. He did not weep when the West ran like gold melted and poured into strange molds. He wept when he put his arms around his sister and she was the right height she should be, hers and not someone else's, and when she would not let go for a long time because it is not always the parting that is the worst thing but the arriving. In the yard, Loras Tyrell set a spear against a post and taught a boy from White Harbor how to turn his wrist without breaking it. In a chamber above, Margaery wrote to Old Town to send books on hardier barley, and to Highgarden to send women who knew how to make a child eat broth when his mother had none to give him. She gave coin to the Silent Sisters and told them to go northward 3 villages farther than they would have, and she did not ask the telling price for their work. She learned the names of the women who sewed in the long hall and the names of the men who did not speak much and who kept their ale to themselves and mended their own boots with neat stitches. The first snow found them before they found Winterfell. Came early and oddly gentle, as if testing. Margaery stood with Robb beside the river and watched flakes melt in the water, as if pieces of a letter falling apart to float unread. Gray wind lifted his muzzle and the snow caught on his fur and held there a moment before shaking free. "They will come," said Robb, and she knew he meant both the white things from stories and the other kind, the ones who wore mail and shouted men's names. It was not fear that moved her hand into his this time, nor duty. It was simply that life was a thing grown between two people and not set atop them like a crown. "It is as it should be," Margaery said. "Winter belongs to wolves, but the bread will be ours." He laughed, and the cold took the sound and threw it back as a more brittle thing that was no less true. The war would not end at the line where any scribe thought to draw it. The West would keep its knife. Stannis would keep his law. Men in gray cloaks would stand on black ice and watch the kind of night no song can soften. There would be babies born in rooms warmed by iron braziers and old men whose bones would ache in ways that made them prophets to those who listened. Rosalind Frye would have a daughter with her father's narrow eyes and her mother's kindness and would teach her that bridges are meant to be crossed carefully and repaired quickly. Randall Tarley would sharpen his sword over habit until it was always sharp. Walder Frye would die angrily, alone, and not understanding why the world had not made more space for him after all he had counted. Davos would sit a little way from a king and say something plain that saved a life, and then another one, and then another. Sansa would grow into a woman with a gift for quiet mercy that does not seek its own fire. And Robb and Margaery, like all those who learn to wear weight as if it were a piece of themselves, would take their place on a bench and rise when they must and stand at a window when the river's ice cracked in ways that foretold thaw and teach each other, season by season, the words their lands used for survival. In the Gods' Wood at Winterfell, when it was built again, never as it had been, always itself, they would stand beneath a face carved in a tree that had remembered men longer than men had remembered it. He would place one palm on the bark and she would place hers beside his, and even if the tree could not hear their speech, it would know the heat of their living. Gray Wind would sit with his fur full of snow and Margaery would call him by his name that at last belonged to her mouth as well. The wind would blow, the cold would come, the bread would bake, and even in the long night, there would be rooms where men and women spoke truth to each other and then went out to do what needed doing. When the spring came, late and slow and suspicious, it came all the same, skittish like a colt, ready to bolt at any sharp sound. The first flowers in the Gods' Wood were pale things that looked as if they were afraid of being seen. Margaery knelt at the edge of the bed and pressed her finger into the earth just enough to feel the warmth no air could catch. She thought of the lime trees at Bitterbridge. She thought of Renly's pavilion, empty and waving. She thought of a green city and a hard throne and a river that had told her a thing she could not quite put into words but that she carried like a pebble in her pocket. Good to touch. Robb came and stood behind her, and his shadow fell across the small pale faces. "They look fragile." "They are," she said. "That is not their weakness." He bent, and together they put their hands to the ground as if blessing it of their own right. Somewhere south, bells rang for law or for love. Somewhere west, a lion thought of his stories. Somewhere east and north, dead things walked in old footprints and men walked after them, breathing. Here in the middle, a king and a queen listened to the ground like country people listening for hooves. The sound came, as it always does, and then another sound after it, and then the business of living filled the space between. Snow came down the white knife like flour from a mill, a soft sift that crept into seams and lit on rope where it melted and darkened and was gone. White Harbor woke to the sound of cartwheels on frost and the smell of fish and cinnamon and lamp oil, and to the sight of southern sails standing out pale against the slate morning. Margaery had expected the sea to look different in the north, and it obliged her. Not green but iron, not playful but patient. The gulls were the same as in Old Town, though. They eyed bread and kings with equal entitlement. Lord Wyman Manderley was carried to the quay in a chair that creaked like an old sail. He had a face made for smiling at children and for biting men who assumed that softness meant surrender. He kissed Margaery's hand, swallowed Robb's in both of his, and promised bread he'd already baked. "We have flour for a winter and half a spring," he swore in a rolling voice, "and salt beef that would make an Iron Man weep. The Reach has been our granary before, and now the Reach bows to our queen. What I lack in quickness," he patted his belly without shame, "I make up in holding. White Harbor holds." Margaery liked him at once. The hall he led them through glowed with candles set in whalebone brackets, and the tapestries showed ships in storms and ships in calm both. The smell was fish and spice and a sweetness that belonged to pastry. She had taken care not to wear green that would glare against gray stone. Her gown was the brown of sound earth with the faintest brushed nap that caught whatever light a room offered and made much of it. They feasted like lean people who take care to be grateful without being drunk on it. There was lamprey pie that broke under the spoon just so, and eels and jelly spiced with pepper Margaery suspected had cost as much as a pony. There were turnips, hugged to flavor with butter until you forgot to scorn them. Robb laughed twice and looked at her twice besides. She caught the look and returned it and then turned to Lord Wyman at once, because she was not 12 and because love, like trade, goes best when not made spectacle. "The moat," Robb said when the first trenchers were cleared, and he and Wyman both sobered as if a hand had wiped them. "We cannot wear a crown in the snow if the neck is cut. I took men west. I must take them north. The Ironborn have it like a dog with a bone," said Wyman. He wagged his fingers at a map a servant brought, and the fat around his knuckles made small ripples like water over stones. "They do not know the marsh like a crannogman knows it, but they know how to squat and not be moved. They have beams and arrows and patience born of never tilling a field. A man who does not know a hoe can sit a long time over someone else's road." "Then we will not give them a road," said a voice from the doorway, and for a moment Margaery thought the wall itself had spoken. The man who came in wore no badge and no satin. His hair was threaded with winter, his face with lines that did not apologize. Behind him moved a girl with a spear and a boy with hair black as a raven's wing, and the smell of damp earth came with them. "Howland Reed," Catelyn breathed, standing before she knew she had stood. The Lord of Greywater did not kneel. He inclined his head as if to a wind. "I am sorry that men plow my lands and do not remember the furrows they leave," he said in a voice like low tide. "I will lead you through the neck. I will lift the ground up under your feet. I will put the water where they stand and the dry where you step if you will lay your steps where I tell you." Robb crossed the space in 3 strides and took the man's forearms, then stepped back and looked at him as his father had looked at men his father trusted. The boy behind Howland looked at Robb with a gravity Margaery had seen only in sick rooms and in men who have killed once and do not want to do it again. "Mira," Howland said of the girl, and she nodded with a grin that broke her seriousness like river ice. "Jojen," he added of the boy, and that one only blinked twice slow Olish. "You have my thanks," Robb said. He had been careful since wearing the crown to measure out his gratitude like grain, but the words came easily now. "Your messenger found us at Riverrun. I did not think to find you here before us." "I float," Howland said. "My house floats. We do not like stone, but we like the Starks." Margaery saw Catelyn's hands tremble at that and knew there was a door just opened in this room that she could not yet see the other side of. She did not press at it yet. Some doors ask you to enter later. They left White Harbor under a sky the color of a seal's back. The Manderley men set their slow barges on the river with the practiced patience of people who live where a wrong push can drown you and where a right one takes time. Robb went with the Vanguard and the Blackfish and the young Lord Umber, who wore eagerness and fur equally well. Margaery traveled a day behind with Catelyn and Lord Wyman and a scattering of Reach men she trusted because she had learned to tell the difference between brave and noisy. It was strange to call a river knife, she thought, when it made a path this wide and kind. At the border of the neck the river grew tricked. Margaery had never seen ground that could look dry and not be. The reeds whispered in a language she did not know and that men had to learn by falling. The crannogmen met them without ceremony. They wore cloaks woven of swamp and sky so that you saw them when they wanted and did not when they did not. Their boats were like the strips of bark that a child peels and sets on rainwater for a race. "Do not show your teeth," Mira Reed told Margaery the first time they stepped down into the floating ways. "The midges will find you if you smile." "I am a lady," Margaery said gravely. "It is not polite to show teeth." They grinned at each other anyway and then schooled their mouths. Margaery learned to walk on paths that were not there until you trusted them. She learned to judge a hummock by its shadow. She learned that a little weight set just so could shift a mile of water very slightly so that a boat could go where no boat had gone last summer. She acquired a new vocabulary: quaking bog, deadfall, sudden suck. She came to see how a man with a map and a plan and a bright red cloak could die here of his own certainty. The Ironborn at Moat Cailin had built their siege as if against a southern army, their palisades a little back from the stone, their stake pits wide-mouthed, their watchfires in tidy lines. They had not built against the ground itself. The first nights the crannogmen walked into their tents without sound and took away 3 men and a bundle of arrows and a pot of soup to measure discipline. The second night they cut cords, and a dozen tents fell at once. The men inside crawled out covered in canvas and curses and were shot in the legs. After a week the Iron Men swore at the reeds as if reeds heeded oaths and huddled on the stone like cats on a fence with dogs beneath. When on a gray morning the trees themselves seemed to lean and water took the place of a path and the wolf's host rose from fog with a roar like something old, many of the Ironborn broke without having yet bled. It was not a neat fight. There is no neat move against men who have made themselves a nest in ruin. The middle tower, where the old king's heads had once crowned the walls, belched men in iron who did not mind losing fingers if they took 2 of yours. The Blackfish took an axe at the cheek and came away with more scar to hold his face together. Galbart Glover lost 2 teeth and a brother that day and would not look down from the stones to where the body lay until the horn sounded stop. Robb went up first in 3 places, and in the end men said they had seen him in 5 because men will make a single man many when they want a story that can be told quickly. Grey Wind's fur was painted with other men's blood and with mud like paint, and at the last he took the knee of a man who might have been a captain, and the man howled and was taken. When the fighting hung back into breath, when the moaning began to take on rhythm. Help, water, mother, God, Robb stood on the wall where the old heads had once watched and put a hand on the stone. Margaery came up to him with difficulty because stairs here had learned to hate feet. She had only 1 small cut on her palm. She had gotten it on rope and then not let go. "Moat Cailin," Robb said, and the words were less name than exhale. She touched the stone beside his hand. It was rough with old burns, as if a great fire had once licked it and died of lack of interest as much as of rain. "It knows us now," she answered. "That will do." That night they slept under canvas on a spit of ground that could hold itself. The wind had more to say here. It had learned to shape itself to flatness and to carry birdsong farther. Mira sat by the fire and cut marsh bird into joints with a competence that made Catelyn look away because she had seen a girl that aged with a needle and had not seen that girl since. Jojen listened to the fire crackle the way a man listens to a dream upon waking, trying to catch its pieces before they go. He looked at Margaery once long and then at Robb and then not at either again. When the last bones were thrown into the dark, Howland Reed pulled a bundle from a bag that had never gotten wet. He unwrapped layers of oiled cloth and then a little casket of hammered tin and then a twist of gut sealed with tar. Inside lay 2 teeth from a stag and a shard of bone carved with dots and lines no maester would call writing. "We built a house that cannot be found," he said in his low water voice. "We put boys away in it until they grew too large for the walls. We sent them walking with a man who goes walking in the dark. You will not have to mourn Bran and Rickon, Lady Stark. Not this year." Catelyn's face emptied and filled in the same instant. She sat down without realizing she'd sat. Margaery did not touch her. Touching at the wrong time turns grief into something else. She looked at the old bone and thought of how much of the world is written on things that can break. The Blackfish put his hand on his niece's shoulder without words and without anything like comfort, and it was exactly right. "We will not speak that where the air can carry it," Robb said when breath returned to more than one chest. "My mother has back her breath. That is for now enough." The morning after they took the moat, Rickard Karstark murdered 2 boys in a cell. There are some sentences that prefer to come blunt. The boys were Lannister cousins taken when the West Host shattered the first time. They had eaten good stew and learned to play a northern game with small carved dogs and horses and squares on a board. The guards weren't cruel men. They had been told to keep the boys breathing, not watched. Karstark had always looked at the captives the way one looks at a splinter under the skin. Small but maddening, easy to forget until it throbs. In the night that had followed news of Bran and Rickon, false news for once, thank all trees, he saw Grief's old door open and walked through it with his sword. Blood runs quick and serious on old stone. The boys died as boys die, with surprise, as if they more than anyone had expected mourning. When Robb went down into the place where it had happened, he stood a long time without speaking. The guards stared at their own boots as if that could make them new. Karstark did not bow his head. He looked like a man who has told himself a necessary story so many times he can no longer hear how others might tell it. "You have killed my justice," Robb said at last, returning up into light, and Karstark sneered without moving his mouth. "I have killed lions," he said. "I have done what you have not let yourself do." "Those were boys," Catelyn said, and her voice had no softness in it because sometimes love is without it. "The Lannisters did not ask my sons their age," Karstark answered. "You take my grief and rip it into bandages for your southern bargains." Margaery had learned to be quiet at councils that were not hers. This was not a council. This was a court. She stood a little behind Robb and a little to the side the way she would always stand and said nothing, and it made the room steadier to have her there and saying nothing. "You will have a clean death," Robb told the Lord who had followed his father to war and his father's father before that, and Karstark laughed with no joy in it. "Make it long," he said, "so I can remember my sons while you swing." When he had gone to have it, when Robb had lifted the sword as his father had done, and when he had found that the weight went where it must and that he could not make grief smaller by performing the work cleanly, and that he would do it cleanly nonetheless. Men looked away because watching a king be his own good man unsettles the part of a man that relies on calling the world crooked to excuse oneself. Later, Margaery found him washing his hands not as if they were dirty, but as if he had forgotten what they were for. "You did right," she said. "I did necessary," he said. "The right would have been to spare him and to have that mercy taken for weakness and to lose 3 houses that need me to be stone and not bread. The right is a story. The necessary is a map. I am tired of maps." "You may be tired," she told him, and took his hands out of the water and held them, "and still be king." He looked at her then with a gratitude that carried less shape than the ones he showed to men. "Will they follow me after this?" he asked. "They will follow because of this," she said. "There are men who only know the road when it is paved in other men's bones. You showed them a mile marker. It does not mean you are not a man. It means you must allow yourself to be one when doors are shut." He put his head to her shoulder for a small time, as if to a tree he trusted, and then drew straight and went to sit in a tent full of maps again, because war makes men repeat. Dreadfort was a stone that did not welcome hands. It rose out of its own shadow like a thing that liked the taste of its name. Roose Bolton had written courteous letters from Harrenhal requesting grain and patience, 2 commodities that dwindle. He had praised the new alliance with the Reach while sending small compliments to the Freys and smaller to Lord Wyman, who measured courtesy in pies and found Bolton's servings meager. There were rumors in every hearth of a bastard who hunted men for sport and called it work. There were men who had worn dread for years now calling it custom. The raven that broke it brought its own blood with it, rasping and ragged, and it landed on the wrong sill and could not be persuaded to abandon it. The message it held was stitched under the thread of a Bolton seal that would have made a maester set out more candles before cutting. The wax parted belching small smoke, and what lay beneath was the patience finally bared. A list of supplies to be diverted, a series of names to be told to go walking in the winter and not to come back, a plan to send Reek to Winterfell when the snows blew hard enough that men could be made to believe what a man in rags whispered in a hall that wanted to believe. Catelyn's eyes went colder than the stone beneath her feet when she read. The Blackfish swore softly, like a man who regrets a map's trick. Robb did not swear. He put the paper on the table with the gentleness one uses for something that can still bite. "Bring me Lord Wyman," Margaery said before anyone else spoke, and her voice surprised the men enough that they looked at her and not at Robb for the length of a breath. "And send for Meege Mormont. Send for Galbart Glover. Send for the Umbers if you can get the Greatjon to fit through a door. Men are vain. They like to be sent for. They came swifter because it had been the queen that asked." Margaery stood at the table and put her finger on the river and then on the long road through Barrowton and then up from the east. "Seal the causeways," she said to Howland, and he nodded as if she had asked him to carry in kindling. "Wyman, send up river barges with false floors. We will put men under water and float them where a man in a tower cannot count. Meege, take what bears you have and go to the lands west of the Weeping Water and make it a place where a man with smooth boots cannot walk. Blackfish?" She looked to Brynden Tully and saw his mouth already shaping the work she had not yet spoken. "Take men you do not like enough to cry for and lay them in the hills east of Dreadfort 3 nights' march. Light fires in a row and then not at all. Leave tracks going south and then vanish. I want Ramsay to think he is seeing a ghost of an army until he comes out to beat it and finds it is not there because ghosts do not bleed." "And me?" asked Lord Wyman, mouth buttery and eyes bright. "Bring bread," she said, "and boats. I want his men thinking of their bellies until the last hour before we holler at the walls." It took a month to make the trap and 4 days to set it. The Dreadfort garrison was not so large that it could throw away men. It was large enough to think it could afford to kill some at the gate and to smirk doing it. Ramsay did not come out alone to meet challenge. He did not wear silk and smile. He sent men who had done things to other men that would make a man spit in his own helmet and called that proof of loyalty. They opened the gate on the 3rd day when the row of fires marched away from the walls in a line a child could read. And there they were met by the women of Bear Island in cloaks that the sea had taught to keep secrets and by crannogmen who had learned to stand on a water lily and not have it notice. The Northmen fell on them then like a door that you had thought would move and that refuses. And from the river that was not a river but a series of tricks the barges rose as if the ground itself had decided to deliver men. Greatjon Umber laughed like an avalanche and went where laughter has always been a weapon. Galbart Glover drove men with hooks among the archers, and the archers learned how to die on their backs. Lord Wyman sent pies at dawn for the men on the walls, and a man who bites into a good pie at dawn is not thinking of a hook. When the gate fell, it did not groan, cracked like ice and then lay down. Ramsay was not there to die at once, which is not how a story ought to go. He was in a kennel down a passage where walls have learned to sweat, and he had a knife ready, and he made 3 old scars on the Greatjon's arm before he was taken. He did not beg. He did not bluster. He named his father 3 times and then bit a woman who was holding him and took a piece of her thumb and smiled for the first time when she did not cry out. Robb looked at him without speaking. Margaery watched him not speak. She did not think mercy and she did not think justice. She thought of holes in the ground that are deeper than a man thinks and of rope. "You will be tried," Robb said at last. And for a heartbeat the bastard's eyes showed something like disappointment because he had wanted something else. He was taken to a cell with dry straw and that was kindness enough. Theon was found in a room that had once held dogs and was now holding men like dogs. He had been made to be something called Reek, and he had done as told because survival wears many coats. He did not look like the boy who had laughed too easily and competed over arrows. He did not look like a Greyjoy either, which was proof that men can be remade in the wrong hands into something without a name. The first thing he said when he saw Robb was, "I killed them." As if guilt prefers to rush in before questions. "You killed 2 farm boys," Robb said. His voice was not cruel. It simply set the stones where they go. "You burned my home. You took men who loved me and made them hate you. You are not dead. This surprises me and I do not like surprises." Theon's head wobbled as if his neck had forgotten itself. "Kill me," he whispered. Not like a plea, but like a piece of housekeeping long put off. "We will not," said Margaery, unexpected in her own mouth and certain in her bone. "You will live and undo what can be undone. There are iron men raiding on coasts that belong to my king. You will tell Lord Wyman every rock where a boat can land. Every cove where a boy hides his father's whiskey. Every path up a cliff and down to it. You will tell him who is brave and who can be bribed and who cannot. You will live until the work is finished, and then you will meet the gods you have earned." He wept then without making noise, as if water had found its way out of him somehow by itself, and Wyman Manderley stood with a hand like a roast ham on his shoulder and did not move it until the shaking passed. He had lost a son to the Ironborn once. He said nothing about it now because there are times to polish old curses and times to salt new meat. Roose Bolton did not come north when called. He wrote from Harrenhal that he was held by duty and by a broken foot and by a host of matters only he could rightly arrange. Robb sent back a letter that was short as an order and that could have been written by his father. The reply came on thin paper with a stain that could have been anything that makes a stain, and it named excuses that were not even trying to be good. The Blackfish wanted to ride down the river and fetch Roose by one ear like a boy wit. "Hout permission," Catelyn said only, "let him dig his own cell." And Margaery found that she had learned to listen hard when that woman spoke. Word from the south beat at them like weather. Stannis had burned idols in the Great September. He had not burned men on its steps. He had rooted 3 goldcloth men out of a counting house and put them in a smaller room with less light and fewer notes upon the door. Davos Seaworth had taken a ship that had been confiscated from a Myrish smuggler and put it to transporting bread to Flea Bottom until the rats looked sated. The Queen's men wore their flames and did not pause at doorposts with a carved face unless the house had a hungry child in it. Tyrion Lannister had been tried and not killed. He had been sent to his father under banner of truce with 2 guards who had guarded kings and 1 who had guarded Vinegar and would have died for either. He did not make it to the Rock. Robbers who thought they had caught a small fortune took him instead and learned that a Lannister's head costs more trouble than coin. He was ransomed by no one and then by someone who never named themselves, and he vanished like nimble smoke. Cersei still lived and chewed the air around her. Margaery kept the Reach present in the north in ways that could be counted. Sacks of grain with their mouths tied like rich widows, bales of cloth that were not fine but wore well, barrels of apple vinegar to keep men from losing their teeth, plows whose shares would bite at frozen dirt when spring's edge drew near, women with good hands and stubbornness. She knew she could not ask to build a sept at Winterfell. She did not. She found a stone foundation in White Harbor long abandoned and asked Lord Wyman to roof it for the few who would go and pray, and he did so with care because he had a son buried and grief likes places where it can sit. Sansa came to the north under the guard of men who did not sing and of one man who used to. Sandor Clegane found his way to Riverrun bleeding the road, and there he found a day's grace and a bench by the fire, and Sansa looked at him and saw a man who had not been able to let go of a little girl's plea not to kill and who did not know what to do with that. He did not follow her north. He went east. Songs did not grow in his hair. He drank, he slept, he woke with his nightmares like dogs at the foot of the bed. Sansa came on with an escort that made no noise when it rained. When she and Arya met in the Great Hall at Winterfell, because in winter some ends prefer themselves, they did not run. They walked to each other as if on ice and took each other's arms and then cracked into laughter that was crying. Arya's hair had been shorn with a knife. Sansa's had been braided with ceremony that was no ceremony at all. Catelyn stood with her palms to her mouth like a woman in a tale whose prayers actually work. "You look terrible," Arya said first, "because kindness is not always truth's friend." "You smell like a horse," Sansa retorted, and then they held each other hard enough to bruise. Gendry stood awkwardly by the door with a hand on a hammer he had not put down in a year, and he did not know where to look, so he looked at the floor, which did not look back. The Brotherhood without banners had brought Arya as far as they dared. Beric Dondarrion had smiled at Catelyn and had not said the name of the god that kept standing him up. Thuras had kissed a girl and a bottle both and prayed at the heart tree with the embarrassed sincerity of a man doing a thing his old self would have mocked. Brienne of Tarth knelt before Robb and asked to swear her sword to his service for a year and a day, and he took it solemnly because he had seen her hold a blade like a man holds a promise, with the understanding that it will cut him also. He set her over a company that had made sport of breaking lances and told them to unlearn bad jokes. She became the kind of truth men do not tease. Jaime Lannister sat in a cell far from her and practiced being other than he had been by staring at the wall and not picturing himself as anyone who could be gotten drunk again on applause. He had nothing to laugh at, and so he made do with silence. The call from the wall grew louder and thinner both. Jeor Mormont's letters became bones of letters, short, stripped. Qhorin Halfhand had taken a boy with him into the lightless places and had not come back, and rumor said that the boy had come back instead, or that no one had, or that a woman with hair like fire had spoken to a man with hair like night and had seen his shadow leave him and walk and then come back. Men laugh at stories like that because they are afraid to take them into their beds. Samwell Tarly sent a letter that had water damage and 2 words that made even men who do not fear words fearful. They come. We need to send men, Robb said, and no one argued, not even Lord Wyman, who could count a harbor and prefer it to a wall. We need to send warm things. We need to send food that does not go bad. We need to send men who will not desert. We need to send the kind who will stand on a wall and look at a night full of knives and not think of a fire behind them, Margaery said. We need to send second sons with no taste for inheritance and first sons with too much. We need to send men who have not fallen in love yet and men whose loves are old enough to let them go. Who will you send? Asked the Blackfish. I will send Tarly men, Margaery said without smiling, and Lord Randall, who had not laughed in her presence more than once since she had met him, inclined his head the barest inch. I will send boys who have been trained not to run. I will send 2 of my cousins who need to remember that a life can be a service and not a mirror. And I will send a priest, but not one who burns things. I will send a septon who has spent time with cold and learned not to preach at it. You will offend men in King's Landing, Catelyn told her. I will offend them more later, Margaery said. Let them begin their practice now. Stannis's next letter was stiff with cold, and with something like apology carved into its lines by Davos's plainer hand. There is a war in the north that the south cannot name, it said. I call upon the lords of the realm to stand. My ships will go to Eastwatch when the ice allows. If you will match my men with your grain and cloth, I will match your men with my iron. This is not oath. This is arithmetic with blood's numbers. Warden suits you better than King in this matter, Margaery said to Robb, holding the letter so he could see what she had already read 3 times. Kings would send banners with too much cloth and too few men. Wardens send what is needed and make no speeches. I do not crave a new style, Robb said, but I will owe him for this. We will both owe the wall, she said. Debts to stone are the only kind I like. Balon Greyjoy died stupidly, as men like him do, on a bridge, in a sea wind that had taken a taste for his salt. The Iron Men said different things about it around fires. That a kraken had reached up and taken him like a boy scooping a beetle from a puddle. That his brother had blown a horn from nowhere and the wind had curtsied and thrown Balon over. That a god who did not like to be called a god had tugged a sleeve and laughed. What mattered was the result. A king smoot, men shouting on stone, a woman who should have been king because she knew what it meant, a man who would be because men like sleek things when they have been living with tar too long. Euron Greyjoy came with sails sewn of rumor and with a smile like a knife whose maker had enjoyed themselves. Old Town squinted up at the sails and took a faster inventory of its own stores. The red wine fleet, fed and mended, took air like an old horse sniffing a race and moved. The Reach had never loved iron, and the iron loved their fat barns. That is what enmities grow upon. Margaery wrote to her grandmother and received a reply full of stings and sweetness. We will mind your back, Olenna wrote, because you are the part of our back that is standing where the cold is. Keep it turned to us. There is a boy in Old Town we should keep an eye on. He reads more than is good for his spine. We will sit him on a cushion and feed him pies until he forgets recipes we do not like. At Casterly Rock a man died in a bed and in his sleep, if a man whose dreams have always known him to be awake can be said to have slept. Tywin Lannister left a son he had not seen, a daughter he had made too much of and then not enough, and a house that did not know how to be poor. Kevan Lannister took the quill with the same competence with which he had always taken whatever tool was needed and wrote men to tell them how they were to behave. They behaved as men behave when the hand they fear most is gone. Some better, some worse. There was an attempt to break Robb's hold on the Riverlands that looked like a food shipment that went the wrong way. The wagons took the lane to a ford no one used anymore except when doing a secret thing. Men in mail were waiting near a copse with hawthorns, as if hawthorns were not loud. They would have taken the carts and made a tale about bandits and hired graces to mourn. But a widow from Seven Streams had told a reach baker that the lane had grown rutted beyond its wont, and the baker had told a manderly boy with ears and a fondness for older women, and the boy had told a seamstress who'd sewn a split in Margaery's gown, and she had told Margaery. They sent Brienne with men who know how to follow a track and assent both, and the men in mail learned that the stories about the woman in blue were not stories. When Brienne came back, she washed her sword with a care that approached tenderness and ate stew with an appetite like a healthy hound's and said to no one, "We will be having fewer of those now that word has been sent." Sansa walked Winterfell's walls in the mornings when frost made them honest. In the south, she had been made into a sum of other people's decisions. In the north, she began to add herself. She made a garden that would not die too readily. A thing of cabbage and leeks and herbs that do not mind standing under snow, and a few roses that would not be told no. She talked to the women who mended and the men who sharpened and learned where bitterness lives when it does not sit at table as anger. She came to Margaery as a girl goes to a slightly older girl who has found her courage and said, not shyly, "Willis wants a wife." Margaery did not pretend to be surprised. Willis wrote steady letters with jokes tucked in like raisins and with earnestness that would have been dull in a less clever man. He liked hounds and hawks and books and growing things. He had learned to forgive the leg that did not forgive him and to set his chair in places where he could watch without being watched. Sansa had read those letters with a recollection of what it had meant, once to be courted by a song, and had found that she preferred letters. She did not think of King's Landing when she thought of Willis. That was enough. "Do you want to be happy?" Margaery asked, because sometimes the simple question is the kind that knocks a wall down. Sansa stood very still. She remembered a world where wanting happiness had been part of the crime. "Yes," she said. "I want to be quiet. And then I want to be happy." "Then marry him," Margaery said, her eyes bright as well water. "I will write to our grandmother. She will pretend she has reservations, and then she will measure you for a gown without telling you and call it prudence." Arya did not want to marry anyone. She wanted a sword that was both long and small and that would not make men tease. She wanted a horse that could pick its own path and did not embarrass easily. She wanted a man who had killed someone who deserved it to tell her how not to dream of the man's face afterward. The hound was gone. The Brotherhood went on, and she visited them like a friend who has moved to a village over 2 hills and who you see on market days. She asked the Blackfish for lessons and got them. She asked Brienne for them and got different ones. She asked Jojen for something else and learned how to be still long enough that a bird might land near her without fear. "You cannot live in the fight forever," Catelyn told her one night when the wind found the cracks and sang through them as if playing a bone flute. "You must come back. You must sleep in a bed and let it hold the shape of you." "This is my bed," Arya said, not as a child's defiance, but as truth. "It has blankets made of running." Catelyn did not argue. She kissed her daughter's hair and thought of all the ways to be a girl in a world that likes boys to think they make most of the noise. She thought of Margaery, who made less and did more. She thought of Sansa, who had had her voice cut and had found it again in quieter keys. She thought of herself and did not like nor dislike what she saw. She was a woman who had done necessary things. She would do them again for the rest of her life, which she intended to keep having. When winter picked up its pace, when it started to step rather than to drift, when the snow took on the sound of sand in the air, and when men learned the trick of keeping a candle alive by building a little house of their hands around it as they walked, Jon Snow looked out from the wall and saw the first true thing that he would never be able to tell to a man who had not seen it. The night rippled. Something like cold without wind moved, and then there were figures where the ground had been, walking as if the walking hurt the ground. The dead do not moan as poets have it. They are quieter, and that is worse. He thought of his father, though he did not believe in ghosts, and he thought of his brothers and sisters, and he thought, guiltily, quickly, fiercely, of a girl with hair the color of a fox running through ferns. He held the horn in his hand and blew, not so that men would count the blasts on their fingers, though they did, but so that his own chest would not explode with the urgency of a thing that must be told. Stannis came with ships, black and crisp as crows, at the edge of a morning that pretended to be noon. He had too few men, as men who are right often do. He had Melisandre with him, who would have set the night on fire if she could. He had Davos, whose face had been taught to hold light and dark both without showing preference. The fires burned bright on the snow. They are no use against the dead except as courage. Courage is not use, it is fuel. They held the wall because walls are honest when stood upon. Jon killed a man who had once given him a skin of bad ale and said something crude about a girl he had not known. Jon said nothing back. He learned to count arrows by feel. Robb sent men who knew cold and ordered the man who had made his sword to make 2 more a day, and then 2 more besides. Margaery sent cloth of a weave learned from an old woman in Highgarden who had knitted for boys who had gone to sea. She sent vinegar and onions and hard cheese that could be cut with a wire and not spoil. She sent her own fur-lined matane that had been sewn by a girl from Bear Island who frowned a great deal and smiled when she forgot to be careful. She wanted to go, and she did not. She stood in the God's Wood at Winterfell and prayed to a face carved from a tree, which was a kind of admitting she had not expected to like. It is an odd thing, to live through a winter that is the story men will tell after you are dead. It does not feel like a story. It feels like waking and doing simple things with care. The bread must be kept dry. The water must be boiled, because men forget to wash like they forget to pray. The horses must be curried until their coats shine even when no one will see them shine. The gates must be checked twice, always twice. The children must be taught a game to play with their fingers so that the fingers will remember to move in the cold. The old must be sat near fires. The fires must be fed. Margaery walked Winterfell like a gardener walking her beds. The first winter festivals were easy. The flour was still a mound that made men feel brave. The later ones took cunning. She taught women to flavor soup with an inch of smoked meat and a fist of pepper instead of a pound of flesh. She made songs for children that had in them instructions that would, if learned, save their father's toes. She made a boy from Deepwood laugh by showing him, without showing him, that she could cast a snowball with more accuracy than half the archers in the yard. She did not set foot in the God's Wood without some offering, even if only a bit of apple or a curl of wool cut from one of the cloaks to be sewn. Robb ruled without ceremony when ceremony would have been cold for show, and with it when the men needed it to remember what they had agreed to be. He listened. He sent the right men to the right doors. He learned to allow himself 1 laugh a day even when laughter and breath both felt extravagant. He lay sometimes on nights when the wind was held by ice and watched his wife breathing and found that a king who wants to live is a better king than one who wants to be remembered. Ramsay Bolton stood in a cell and waited to be made into a story. Men talked about flaying and names and bastards like they were weather. In the end, it was the old weather that took him. They hung him at Winterfell because the Dreadfort would have liked it too much and because Winterfell needed to send a message to Stones. He did not writhe. He stared at Robb as if at some private mirror and said nothing at all, which was the last pain he could give. His father, noise having done him no good, wrote apology in a hand that had never learned to tremble and swore that his loyalty had never wandered. The letter came back to him with 2 words written small at the bottom. Come, answer. He did not come. He went instead to the rock with 2 men and a hope that a house full of grudges might welcome one more. Houses full of grudges do not welcome. They employ. When the spring finally thought about the possibility of itself, when there were days with a middle to them and when icicles did not threaten like teeth, word went up and down the realm with the sound of carts loosening their wheels. It brought news you could count and news you could not. Willis Tyrell came with a small train, because moving a man like him requires more thought than moving a man who can leap onto a horse at a shout. He came with hounds who loved him and hawks who pretended not to, with books he would not read because there would be too much life to look at, and with a smile he gave to Sansa and then to no one else because men learn the trick of economy and looks if women are spared it. They were wed in White Harbor's hall because it had light and because a ship's bell could be rung for a wedding as surely as for a leaving. Wyman Manderley had a pie set out on a board with a crust that gleamed, and when the knife went in a cloud of doves went up, and then a clutch of little meat pies followed, as if to apologize for the joke. Men from the Riverlands who had learned to distrust weddings relaxed an inch when they were not shot from a balcony. Olenna Tyrell sent a letter that made everyone within earshot laugh twice and wince once. Margaery leaned to whisper to Sansa that if Willis tried to impress her by telling her a lot about hawks, she should let him and then say one small thing true about a hawk and watch him fall in love again in that instant. If there were enemies left, and there are always enemies left, they slept badly that night and the nights after and tried to figure out whether the Queen in the North's knot had become uglier or more beautiful, and whether either option would make it easier to cut. Cersei Lannister tried to drink herself into forgetting she had lost, but wine does not oblige even queens unless they are kinder to it. Euron Greyjoy threw a priest into the sea and taught the water a new name and set a course for a city where men study men and plants as if both would make them gods. Stannis Baratheon watched the wall and did not leave it, because the law is a wall when you let it be and a bridge when you need one. Davos taught a boy letters by writing him the names of the men in his village who had died so that the boy would learn to read with reverence. On a morning when the wind at last smelled of rot and therefore life, Robb sat under a tree that had begun to bud in tiny green fists and told Margaery that when he had first written to her, he had made up a word, Summerfell. She smiled the way you smile at a child who has been brave. It's a good word, she said. It is wrong. Yes, he laughed. I know. There isn't ever that. There is this. He gestured at the ground and at a boy practicing with a wooden sword that already sat right in his hand and at a girl sitting with her boots off near the little start of a pond, dunking her toes like a scandal. There is winter that does not kill us and spring that does not praise us and the work we set between them. There is bread that rises or falls. There is a wolf who will not be called when he wishes not to be called. Grey Wind raised his head and regarded them as if called nonetheless. Margaery took his hand and pressed it, and when he looked down there was a tiny new scar near the knuckle he did not remember getting. I wanted songs, she said. As a girl I thought songs were the river. They are cups. You drink from them. The river is this. He leaned his head back against the bark and closed his eyes for the length of one full breath. I am glad, he said plainly, and she cherished that as one cherishes a small egg found intact after a fox has been and gone. I am glad of you. I am glad of bread. I am glad of men who do not need to be told twice. I am glad of the way the North stands like a man who has decided not to sit. Say you are glad of me again when I tell you you must go south in a month, she said, because truth likes to be mixed into sweetness, so both are swallowed. He opened one eye. Why? Because Old Town has a boy reading books that worry my grandmother, she said, folding her hands in her lap as if coming to a negotiation at last that amused her. Because Euron Greyjoy will not leave us in peace. Because King Stannis would like to remind us that wardenship is a word of his, and he will come to the High Tower to read laws at men unless he is met by men who can read them back. Because the river must remember the sea, and the sea must be taught how not to flood the river. If I go south, will the North sit without me? He asked. The North will be here when you return, because the North does not move unless it wants to and because it knows a circle when it sees one, she said. Sansa will be here. Arya will be here, though not on any day anyone expects her. Your mother will be here. Your uncle will be wherever he must, and that is the same as here. I will be with you. He closed his open eye again and smiled into the bark. Then I am glad of that, too. On the day they rode out, there were more green shoots than yesterday, and children who had not yet learned to love the snow had begun to kick at the melting piles with enthusiasm, as if they were winning at something no one else had thought to fight. Men lined the yard to watch their king and queen, and some of them clenched their jaws against cheer because men do that when tears are too close. Catelyn buckled on Robb's cloak herself because mothers will always want to do something with their hands in the last minute. Margaery's hair was braided close to her head, the way northern women braided when riding long. Practical, nothing to catch on a branch. Sansa stood on the steps with Willis, who had found a way to mount with dignity and sat his horse with work's grace. Arya sat her pony like someone who knew ponies and did not love them but had made a truce. They went down through the winter-bare fields that would be green in a month and saw men with shovels whose shoulders told one story today and would tell another in a season. They passed the place near the river where, last year, A man had died of a fever, and where Margaery had had them burn his mattress and the wood beneath, and had spoken quiet to his wife until the wife's hands had stopped flapping like frightened birds. They crossed a bridge that had been mended with a plank that was straighter than a man who had worked on it in the cold had needed to make it, and admired the perfection for an instant. They took with them men from the Reach and the North both, and there were jokes in the camp at night about words for snow and words for wheat that could not be fully translated. Margaery listened and learned and contributed two of her own that were kind without being condescending. Robb walked the lines like a man who expects to have his own orders argued with and invites it and then decides anyway. They moved south at a pace that would have satisfied a column of merchants and annoyed a troop of jesters, and that, therefore, was exactly right. Old Town smelled of salt and parchment and of the quiet ambition of men who collect knowledge like coins. The high tower stood listening to the sea like a man too tall for any room. Euron Greyjoy had not yet come to knock upon its doors, and yet his absence has weight. It makes men talk louder in taverns. The Citadel's doors opened to Margaery because she came with her grandmother's name, and because she came as queen of a land even maesters had begun to take seriously when measuring grain shipments. They came for her the way you come for a new plant that promises a medicine you had not expected. She let them talk as much as they needed and then as little as she would allow. They met Stannis in a hall too bright for men who have lived too long in snow. He had found a way to bring the law with him, rolled in cases, heavy as bricks. Melisandre came like a flame behind him, and when she saw Margaery she smiled, a slow, bright thing that was neither friendship nor warning alone. Davos came in last and saw Robb and bowed the way men bow to work they respect. The words were measured like flour. The bargains were struck like nails. The Faith sent a man to stand at the back and hold his tongue and watch. The Tyrells sent a cask of deep red and olives and did not send mace, which was a gift greater than wine. When the first blue sail with a black eye was sighted at the edge of the horizon, the bells did not ring. The men who watched the sea had learned that ringing bells early makes panic that tastes like cake before supper. They sent boys instead with legs thin and fast as gulls to run the word through kitchens and upstairs and through rooms where men slept in daylight because night is work. Robb and Stannis looked at each other across a map and did not smile. The city that had once not been theirs came together the way a loom comes together under a practiced hand. They fought the Iron Men in the water and on the piers and in the shadow of a tower that had seen more stories than any bard could sing without boring his audience. There were moments that would have made songs in a court where songs can be afforded. A Manderley boy with a broken-toothed grin setting his shoulder to a boarding plank and shoving it away from a ship full of screaming. A girl with arms like pale rope carrying sand to a place where a fire wanted to be and dumping it without drama. Davos with blood running down into his eye, barking for a rope and having it thrown and catching it one-handed and never once letting the bundle of bread in his other arm drop into the sea. Stannis taking a blow on his shield and not cursing because the cursing would take time he needed for his arm. Robb, wet and cold and grinning for once like a boy with a reckless horse, leaping from one deck to another at a moment that kept a plank from being flung into the faces of men who could ill afford splinters. Euron was not there. That is not how stories that mean to last arrange themselves. He was busy somewhere else making a deal with a man too ambitious for his own family and too clever for his own spine. But his men felt his absence as if someone had whistled and they had not heard which note to obey. They fought like men riding a horse that terrifies them, with skill and fear braided into something strong but breakable. The Redwyne fleet came up with sails that had learned to love wind again, and the Iron Men discovered that there are parts of the sea they do not own. When the day was done, the harbor looked like a room after a bad argument. Chairs overturned, spills that would take work to clean, a satisfaction that no one would admit to having and that no one could deny. There were dead men on the beach, and Margaery went among them with women who had brought linen and courage, and she told the ones who had lived that they would live, and it was enough. Melisandre came to stand near her once and said in a voice like a well-banked fire, "Queen," and Margaery answered in one like a wood stove that keeps a house from freezing, "Priest," and then they went back to their different works. In the quiet after, in a chamber with a window that pretended it belonged to some ship in the harbor, Robb and Stannis met again with their hands, and they wrote their names beneath words that would let the realm stand with less groaning. The Riverlands would have their own courts for river crimes, The North would collect its own taxes and set foot where it pleased. The Faith would not put its nose into a god's wood. The Red God would not put its flame into a sept, not where Margaery might see. Bread would travel from the south to the north with chits that a man could understand without a maester by his side. Men would go to the wall when told without argument they had learned to think made them men. And if the lions come down from their rock? Stannis asked dryly, because he has known how to be a cat when needed and prefers not to play at it anymore. They will come down hungrier, Robb said. Hunger makes a man either polite or foolish. We will feed them the wrong things and let them choke. Davos smiled at that, small and to himself. Margaery looked at him and saw his sons in that smile, living and dead, and for a moment she wished for him a world in which men like him could have stayed on their own boats and smuggled oranges and never learned the weight of a crown they do not wear. Then she remembered that the boy with the deep eyes at Winterfell would not exist in such a world, and she accepted this one. They went back north in a green that had decided to take its time, and that was good. On the road they passed carts with babies swaddled so stiffly they looked like little logs and laughing louder than the wheels complained. They saw a fox cross a stream on stones, looking more like a woman hopping to avoid getting wet than like a creature of cunning. They watched a storm form over a hill and then move away, and the feeling it left was like a promise kept. At Winterfell, the trees had gone from fists to open hands. Sansa sat in her little garden reading letters with a face that had learned to be less careful, and Willis dictated a note to a man about hawks and did not mention hawks once, out of love and effort. Arya was not where anyone expected her to be. Later it was discovered that she had spent the afternoon teaching a boy to hold a sword the way one holds a nettle, firmly so it does not sting. Catelyn had a shawl around her shoulders the color of the river when the sun walks upon it, and she was making a shirt for a man who did not need it and would wear it anyway. They went to the Godswood because stones have ears and so does bark, and they told it everything. They told it the things men call victories and the more important things that make a winter go by without too many graves. They told it the names of men who had stood before it, and of a girl who had learned to sleep, and of a woman who had learned to laugh again and then did it often to make sure she did not forget how. They told it that Margaery Tyrell, Queen in the North and of the Trident besides, had learned 7 words for snow and had invented 3 that the North had decided to adopt. Silk snow that falls in a room where a baby sleeps, teeth snow that bites your cheeks and makes you think of being young, and bread snow that settles on the fields in the measure that promises spring. That night, in the hall, they ate fish from their own river and onions from their own beds and bread that rose the way a heart does when it realizes it has not been wasted on the wrong face. Men sang, but not the old songs, because those belong to nights that require them. They sang new ones that would not last, which is the sweet, honest kind of song a people makes most days. When Margaery lay down, she was tired the way a field is after harvest. Emptied in the best way. Robb curled around her as if guarding a flame. She thought, before sleep took her with a hand over her eyes like a mother's good hand, that flowers can grow anywhere that someone thinks to put a bit of compost under them, and that wolves will tolerate petals if the roots run deep enough. Outside, the night walked like a man checking doors. Inside, the day that would come tomorrow assembled itself without noise. There would be grief. There would be new men who thought themselves clever and who would need to be taught to be useful instead. There would be old women whose advice would save whole villages. There would be those who prayed to fire and those who prayed to faces and those who prayed to silence. Sometimes the prayers would be answered, but more often they would not, and the people would go on anyway, which is its own holiness. There would be children who would never hear aught about the South except from men who exaggerated. And there would be a day many years hence when some boy would ask his mother what a reach rose looked like, and she would show him a bloom that had managed, somehow, to be coaxed into northern soil and had opened under a sun that had hosted wolves. In the morning, Margaery went to see the baker. She asked him to teach her to make a loaf so that when the day came she might set it in the oven herself and know the feel of the dough under her hands. He showed her the trick of kneading so that the air is folded in like hope. She tried and failed and tried again, and her laugh when it finally looked right was the sound that made 3 men in the yard look up from their work and grin at each other like boys. Robb came in and stole a bit of dough, and she slapped his hand and then gave him another piece to eat, because love is not laws and does not need to pretend to be them. When the loaf came out, it was not pretty, but it was good, and that, they both agreed, is exactly the right lesson for a queen to learn.